I think we're gonna go ahead and get started. Thank you everybody for coming today. My name is Andres Martinez, and I direct the Bernard Schwartz Fellows Program here at New America. And this is a day of great pride for us here at New America because one of our all-star Schwartz Fellows, Nick Thompson, has just published this wonderful book. And in many ways, Nick encompasses what we strive for in our fellowship program, which is to bring fresh, new voices to policy conversations. And Nick is a jack of all trades in the sense that his day job is to be an editor at Wired, and in that capacity, and in his thinking about technology, Nick has enriched New America's understanding about a lot of cutting-edge debates in the tech realm. And yet, you know, in his own time, he writes this masterful dual biography of two leading thinkers of the Cold War, which is both a trenchant look at two very poignant personalities who had tremendous staying power, and it's also just a great intellectual history of foreign policy throughout the Cold War. So I have to remind myself after having read this book that Nick is also a tech guru. So I'm in awe of your range. But I want to get started. There's also this, you know, this book would be an important book in any terms, but the fact that there's this personal connection, I think, is very titillating, and how that influenced how you went about this and how the book came about, I think is something that we're all probably very curious about, the fact that you are the grandson of Paul Nitze, who I think in many ways is sort of the Forrest Gump of the Cold War. I mean, you know, there he is interrogating Albert Speer at the end of the war, you know, and he's poking about Hiroshima, assessing the damage. You know, he's in the Pentagon building when it's stormed during the Vietnam War, and then he's kibutzing with this guy in Plains, Georgia, who has presidential aspirations. He's at Reykjavik with Gorbachev and Reagan. What a grandfather.
He was fired, I believe, fired or demoted by every president from Eisenhower to Bush, with the exception of Reagan.
So at what point, I'm just to start off with the personal here, at what point did you kind of, as you were growing up, realize that, you know, Grandpa was this towering historical figure, and what did you do with that?
It might have been, I was invited to the White House when I was in the 4th grade, but I don't think I grasped it because my main memory is being upset that I missed a soccer playoff game. But he had his picture in the paper one time on Grandparents' Day or something. I was in the 3rd or 4th grade, and it was very exciting to have him around. And then when I was in the 6th grade, I wrote a term paper about the Geneva negotiations. And so that was when I was interested and learned what ICBM meant, or at least that ICBMs were, you know, missiles that we could
And did you write sort of according to Grandpa?
Yeah. No, I remember the beginning was, you know, something like, you know, January 1907, one of the most important Americans came into this world or something. I looked at it when I was into this pile of things from my grandfather. I looked at it while I was doing the reporting for this book. So I certainly knew when I was a young guy that my grandfather was important. But I didn't, by the time I was 18, 20, my grandfather was sort of checking out. And I didn't actually ever have long debates or intellectual conversations. I never discussed Harry Truman. I never discussed nuclear weaponry with him. So I had an awareness of who he was, but I hadn't become immersed in it. And I think some of what drove this book was curiosity to try to get inside of his mind and try to get inside of his world in a way that I hadn't been able to as a young man.
So do you feel that this was a process of getting to know him in a way more so than you had known him when you were
absolutely, yeah. And sometimes, gosh, what an admirable, wonderful life. I'm so proud of him. And other times, Gramps.
Well, that comes across loud and clear. I mean, when you're reading this book, you completely forget that there's any familial relationship because you're pretty tough on him.
Well, that was there were going to be a couple, when I started this project, I knew there were going to be a couple of structural problems and a couple of very hard things to overcome. And one of them was going to be, how do I write this as a historian, but how do I not deny that he's my grandfather? You can't pretend it's not there. And so the strategy I chose, which I hope comes across, was to introduce it at the very beginning. Say, look, I'm Paul Nitze's grandson. This is a fact, and this is true, and this has influenced the way people talk to me. It's absolutely influenced the documents I got. This book would certainly not be possible without me having been his grandson, because I wouldn't have had his private papers, and George Kennan's family wouldn't have given me George Kennan's diary. So everything, this whole book is based upon things that I acquired because I was his grandson. However, this is not a book about Gramps. I tried to write it as a historian who had no connection to him would do it. So introduce it at the beginning, put it on the back cover, and then hope that, as you said, people completely forget that when they read the narrative and read the story and just think of him as Paul Nitze.
So how would you synthesize this half-century-long debate or disagreement between these two sort of intellectual authors of our Cold War strategy?
What do you mean synthesize it? How would I?
If for those who haven't read the book, or let's say when your son is 10
right,
and he's starting to wonder about great grandpa, how would you discuss why? I mean, how would you explain why you've labeled one a hawk and dove, and what that meant in the context of?
Yeah, the title, The Hawk and the Dove, is it's for 80% of the book. Nitze is the hawk. He's the man who believes that we need more missiles. The Soviets are coming. We need to build up our weaponry, not only to defend against all the horrible things that might happen, but because any conflict at all will be decided in part by who has the advantage at the highest level. Right? If we're deciding who's going to get basing rights off Turkey, it's going to depend partly on who has larger ICBMs. Because if they know that they have more ICBMs, then this will happen, and this will happen, and this will happen, and this will happen, and eventually they'll win. So therefore, they'll push us at the beginning, and we won't be able to push back. So everything depends on this, this complicated mathematics of warfare. And Kennan believed that this is utterly absurd. This is a joke. These nuclear weapons have come to dominate our consciousness. We should just get rid of all of these things. They're horrors. And this debate, what's so interesting about this is that Nitze and Kennan are quite close. From 1945 to 1949, they worked together. They worked together on the partition of Germany. They worked together on the Marshall Plan quite closely. And then this question comes up in the fall of 1949. The Soviet Union sets off their first nuclear weapon. And suddenly, America no longer has a monopoly, and so we have an arms race. And so the news comes to Truman. It comes to Acheson, and Acheson goes to the policy planning staff. Kennan is the director of the policy planning staff, Nitze's deputy, and says, "Okay, guys, we've got to figure out what to do. Are we going to build a hydrogen bomb? That's really the most important question of the fall." And so Nitze and Kennan say, okay. They have dinner, September 29th, 1949. They seem to get along. Everything goes nicely. They're at Nitze's house. And then for the rest of the fall, they go in totally different directions. And by the end of the fall, Kennan, as is his wont, has ensconced himself in a little office and cut everybody off, and he's written a 79-page paper, and it quotes Shakespeare, and it quotes Gibbon, and it's this wonderfully eloquent thing, and it foresees everything that will happen in the arms race, and it talks about, we will build these, the Soviets will be, suddenly costs will come out of control, we'll have no way to stop it, and he knows exactly what's going to happen, and he comes out, and he's tired, he's sleepy, and he's confused, and he's sick, and he's depressed, and he gives this masterpiece. He says, "It's the greatest thing I've ever written," and he hands it to Acheson. And Acheson come on, I'm not going to read a 79-page paper. I've got to decide this by 2 o'clock. Nitze, meanwhile, spends the whole fall, working the bureaucracy, trying to get this person, trying to get that person, trying to exclude this person, trying to set up security clearances so this person won't be able to read this, writing memos, handwriting on everything he sees, working Acheson. He's decided we actually need this hydrogen bomb because if we don't build it, the Soviets are going to build it, and then they'll have leverage. So at the end of this debate, Nitze is completely on one side. We need more weapons. We must go forward on this path. Kennan is on the other side. We can't build these. And you've actually seen how they're going to operate for the rest of their lives. Nitze becomes this player on the inside, doing absolutely everything he can to work every little bit of the system. And Kennan has become this great dissenter who writes an admittedly lovely 79-page paper, but utterly useless. So that's where they diverge. That's where they sort of become the hawk and the dove. But to get back to that title, I mean, it's a title. And Nitze, Nitze, he is definitely a hawk for most of the Cold War. And when he's not in power, he's an incredible hawk. When he's outside of power, always a hawk. And when he's inside of power, and when he actually has to make a decision, he becomes a dove, right? So during the Korean War, this very interesting question comes to him at the policy planning staff. We have information that the Soviet Union is actually fighting with the North Korean pilots, and they're dressing up as North Koreans, and they're out there. And we need to know what to do with it. Now, a true hawk would say, we need to use this. We need to leak this to the press. We need to rile people up, and then we need to expand the war. Nitze does. He says, okay, let's take that report. Let's get all the copies in one place, and let's burn them. And let's never tell anybody. We don't need this war to go any further. He actually works very hard to try to stop Douglas MacArthur from going north. So when there's real conflict, he pushes back. During the Vietnam War, in the early days, he says, no, let's not get involved here. And then in the later days, under Lyndon Johnson, he tries to pull the United States back. Then, of course, as many of you are quite familiar with, and some of you worked near or with him on this, he goes on this renegade mission to solve all the arms control problems with his walk in the woods in the early 1980s. And then at Reykjavik, he pulls an all-nighter trying to create this massive arms deal. I mean, no one tries harder to get an arms deal in the Reagan administration than Paul the Hawk Nitze. Kennan, he's this dove, get rid of our weapons, all the liberals love him. But he's this incredibly fierce conservative on social issues.
Right.
This comes across in the book, but for example, just to pull one example of 100, during the 1960s, all these students are demonstrating against the Vietnam War, and Kennan is testifying in front of Congress against the Vietnam War, and he sees very early what will happen. He writes these wonderful essays, but the students who think he's this great icon, he hates them, despises them. They're unhygienic, they're sloppy, they're using drugs. They walk around barefoot, and his diaries are full of these disgusted comments. And he writes a long essay to the student protesters saying, you don't understand the way the world works. You happen to be on the right side on this issue, but that doesn't matter. If there actually is conflict that you want, I will be on the other side of the barricades because of the social structures that you are trying to destroy. So that's not the work of a simple dove.
Well, I think one of the things that was interesting was that in any particular moment of time, there were clearly people who were far more hawkish than Paul Nitze.
Right.
And there were very clearly, people who were far more dovish than George
Except
Kennan.
for maybe a brief period in the late 70s.
Yes. But on the whole, I think the labels apply to this ongoing debate that the two of them are having.
Yeah.
One of the things that struck me, though, was also they seem to have far more than their policy disagreements. They seem to have very fundamental disagreements about the nature of this country, both about human nature, but also about the nature of this country,
Right.
and the ability and competence of this country to pull off kind of the roadmap that George Kennan painted in the late 40s about how to deal with the Soviet Union over a very protracted period of time in an atmosphere where you have these nuclear weapons and with the temptation always to use them. And it's interesting how, as one reads your book, you really get a sense of how your different perspectives on human nature and on the ability of this country to get something done and to sort of have a stick-with-itness, if you will, over time, bleeds into policy prescriptions. And I think that was probably something that was just fundamentally flawed about George Kennan and his ability to see that the country could really pull off what he had prescribed. But talk a little bit about that.
Well, this is a huge point of Kennan's worldview. So when Kennan's in power, both Nitze and Kennan have lots of confidence in the government's ability to do right as long as they're making the decisions, and virtually no confidence in the government's ability to do right when they're not making the decisions. That's true of both men. Kennan, because he's out of power longer, has a longer period of time where he's critical. But
he also questions, our very system of government, and he rails against
Absolutely.
the founding fathers, and he wants. In that I mentioned to you, there's a passage in his diary in 1956 where he talks about how the country would be better off without California, Texas, and Florida. And our Latin American fringe, he called it.
You think he's wrong on that?
Having grown up in Mexico and being a huge George Kennan fan, I didn't know what to make of that. But this, whereas Nitze seems to be a great sort of rah-rah cheerleader for the American way and the sort of optimistic view that if you play football on Thanksgiving and network your way and send campaign contributions to the right candidates, anything is possible.
No, absolutely. So Nitze really believes the system works. He believes there are flaws. We need to work them out. But, this is the greatest system of government ever created. I love this country. I will do everything for it. Every 4th of July I would go there and he would shoot up fireworks with an American flag on it. He's not a rah-rah simple patriot, but at a deep level he had profound love for this country. Kennan, certainly from 1949 onward, and probably from 1947 onward, believed, political scientists call it realism. He hated that word, but he really believed that because of the way Congress works and because of the way the American culture works, we actually cannot do good in the world. That America is so fundamentally flawed in the way it sees the outside world and its lack of understanding, its lack of appreciation for understanding how these things work. Every time we engage with the world, we will mess it up. So therefore, you have two solutions. Either, from time to time he would say, I have a big idea for how we can do it better, and let's try this. But most of the time he would say, you know what? let's just stay away from everything. And some people would say, I mean, a lot of people are quite critical of that view, but it also was somewhat resurgent at the time of the Iraq War, the sense that even if you have the best intentions, that the way Congress acts, the way the American press acts, the way politics acts, you will end up with bad policy that muck things up. And that was Kennan's view. And that's partly why the last major interview he gave in his life when he's 98 years old, he gave an interview with the Hill newspaper, and he said, look, this is the October before the April invasion. He said, you go into Iraq and you know where you start. You have no idea where it will end. And I can guarantee you that forces beyond our control that we can't comprehend will make our policy terrible, and we should not go in there. Right. And that was sort of consistent throughout his life. And it's very cynical, very dark, not very supportive of this country in that way. But often, there's a lot you can say for it.
Now, he spent a great deal of his life complaining that he was deeply misunderstood, and that he'd authored our containment policy. And by the way, one of the things I really liked about your book was the weaving of the sort of personal and the historic. And you introduced the long telegram, the famous telegram that George Kennan sent from the embassy in Moscow in 46, was it?
Yeah.
In response to a query for, why are the Soviets being so hostile? And he sits down and he writes this 4,000-word telegram. But the way you introduce it, you have the setting is this young clerk who's on a Friday evening looking forward to her date with a Swedish diplomat. And you just picture this, in comes the nerdy boss and plops down a 4,000-word telegram, and so much for her date.
Well, one of my favorite interviews. So I interviewed this woman, Martha Mottner. I have no idea that I just knew she had served in the embassy. I'd been desperately searching for somebody who'd served in the embassy with Kennan, and I sit down to interview her at her house, and I say, "Do you remember anything about the long time?" Oh, I was there. Oh, and what do you remember? Oh, I had this hot date, and then she had this wonderful line. Kennan comes down with his telegram. It's stacked up. He's been lying. He's been sick. It's, I'm sure, extremely dramatic. This tall, gloomy figure. Send this. And she looks at it and she says, "Oh, come on, you've said all this before."
That's right. But so he later on spent a lot of time arguing that he had been misunderstood and that he didn't really mean for containment to acquire such a militaristic taint, and like with a lot of other subjects, he just felt deeply misunderstood. There seems to be a lot of evidence that he might have misunderstood himself, his earlier self, as much as others did. But where do you come down on that? And in the end, didn't the unwinding of the Cold War, the fact that it did end the way it did, prove him wrong in some ways in terms of the ability of the country to walk this fine line that Nitze was trying to walk, of building up, these stockpiles to then negotiate them away? And I mean, he really was prophetic, Kennan, at the outset, in stating that we just have to outlast this rickety Soviet empire. And in fact, it was people who were more hawkish than him, as we all know, who felt that once a country goes communist, there's no rolling it back other than Armageddon. So I mean, where do you come down on the sort of revisionism of Kennan, whether by others or by himself?
All right, so Kennan lays out the theory of containment in the X article in 1947, and what we need to do is we need to use all non-military forces to prevent the Soviet Union from pushing beyond its border, from moving forward. We need to, he was happy to work with it. He helped set up the Covert Operations Department of the CIA. He was very happy with covert operations. He was very happy with the Marshall Plan would be part of political containment. Let's build up our allies so that they're not vulnerable to Soviets coming in there and trying to take over their governments. And let's try to prevent communists from spreading. So he writes this article and calls it containment. And then, a question is raised, well, does this containment of yours, sir, involve weapons? And he doesn't really answer that when he's in office. But then, of course, we do follow a policy of containment to a certain degree, but it involves weapons, and a lot of weapons, and Paul Nitze is responsible for many of those weapons. So Nitze, later on in his life, is asked, what do you think of Kennan's policy of containment? He said, I think it's great, and I made it realistic. But then there is this great controversy, and it peaks in the 1970s. And there are a couple of fascinating stories here. So Kennan hates the idea that he is considered the father of America's Cold War strategy, that we have this militarized version of containment. It just drives him crazy. In his memoirs, one of my favorite sentences is he he talks about how he feels like he had slightly loosened a boulder at the top of a hill, and he's watching it careen down a mountainside. And he gives a speech in '77 when this debate is sort of at its apex, and he says, "The containment doctrine has followed me around my entire life like an unwanted dog, nipping at my heels through everything I've ever done." And so the answer is both yes and no. And yes in the sense that, so some people in the '70s said, look, Kennan is certainly responsible for this. How can he claim that policy is all wrong? He came up with this policy, and that's not quite fair. He does not. The version of containment as pushed both in the X article and in the speeches he gives leading up to it, where he talks about the famous sentence in the X article says, to stop the Soviet Union through a series, of counterforce. And so the critics, latched onto that line and said, he's using counterforce. What is force if it's not weapons? Come on. But if you read all the speeches that Kennan gave up leading to that article, they talk about counterpressure. And that's a very different word, and it's much less militarized. So in a sense, Kennan is right. The critics are wrong. He didn't really militarize it. It's also true, though, he was protesting a little bit too much and a little bit unfairly and a little bit deviously. He did something which I think is one of the, at the end of the book, Kennan says all these horrible things, and in some ways he's a not a likable person. But at the end of the book, you end up with this. At the end of the research process, and with this incredible respect for his mind, his actions, his deliberance, and just an incredible respect for George Kennan, except a few moments, and one of them is this moment in this middle of this debate in the mid to late 1970s, and he goes back through all of his old speeches, and he's all these papers that are open at the Princeton Library, and he says, you know what? There are a bunch of speeches where I talk a little militaristically in 45, 46, and I'm going to take these and I'm going to hide them. And he locks them away. And so one of the set of documents that I got, the first time anybody got them, were all these speeches. And they talk about, well, in 1946, we could drop one atomic bomb on the Soviet Union and sure, knock them out and teach them a lesson. And so there's there was a much more militaristic Kennan in 46 than Kennan would admit. So I think it's fair to say that he was slightly misinterpreted in that in those great debates in 77, 78, he was probably more right than wrong, but he kind of wanted the whole cake, and he didn't deserve it.
I was astonished at the ability of both men to hold a grudge.
Yeah,
it was truly awe-inspiring, and the personality. There was that great moment in the '70s where your grandfather's invited to some conference, and he can't attend because he's sick, but he sends a note saying, whatever John Lewis Gaddis is going to say is wrong.
Right, that's the entirety of the
preemptive strike.
Right. Anything that John Lewis Gaddis says at this conference is wrong.
So what was the most disappointing, coming back to the family connection, the fact that this was your grandfather, was there something particularly shocking or disappointing that you learned about Nitze as you went along?
It could have been, it could have gotten weird. I learned a lot about George Kennan's affairs. And some of it's in the book, some of it's not. And that was, if I had found that about my grandfather, that would have been extremely strange, but I did not. There were rumors that he had an affair with Grace Kelly, but they're not true. I reported that one out. I got very frustrated with him in the late 70s, where I felt like he was using his peak at the Carter administration to act in ways that I didn't think were, certainly that we know now, he was off base, and where I felt like he probably knew at the time he was off base, and he had let the Paul Warnke hearings where he blasted his friend Paul Warnke, declared he was a better American. I think were quite a low moment in my grandfather's life, and I didn't respect him as much during those periods. I learned. I got his FBI file. I learned all about the FBI investigations into whether he was a Nazi sympathizer and whether my great grandmother was a Nazi sympathizer. But there wasn't a whole lot there, and the FBI sort of abandoned those investigations, though they were requested by Joseph McCarthy in 1953. I found a little note in the FBI files that Senator McCarthy has asked for a copy of these records, which was an interesting find. Wow. But there was he lived a very honest and open, and I think admirable life. So there was shockingly few moments where I said, "Oh my God, if I publish this, what will my mom think?"
One thing that's that when you look at this remarkable generation of statesmen that emerged from World War II and are suddenly tasked with managing this American empire that in the past could sort of recede back onto itself. This generation of so-called wise men and such. There are two things that come to mind in terms of today's reality versus the span of their careers. And I'd like to hear your thoughts on whether you think our political dynamics today would be so welcoming to people like that. I mean, Kennan certainly it was a bit of an outlier and difficult for his colleagues to stomach even back then. I mean, just his sheer appreciation for nuance and the length of his writing, if nothing else. But I'm reminded there was a moment where Nitze is nominated to be the Secretary of the Navy, and there was this interesting controversy in his confirmation hearings because he had once, and I forget exact context, but I guess he had mused out loud about whether it might not be better for the U.S. to surrender all its nuclear weapons to the UN, I guess,
exactly.
At some point earlier. And some senators give him a hard time about this. But then he gets confirmed. And I'm thinking, like, nowadays, not so sure the outcome would have been
the person who...
So there are just two questions. One is about whether we are as tolerant of people who have such provocative minds, because nowadays, the paper trail, and you see this most clear in Supreme Court nominations. But whether Kennan's fears about the nature of our democracy in a way have become more acute in terms of our ability to bring in people like this into government. And a second related question is whether you think that we have departed a bit from a system where you have these, wise men and people whose careers can span, just the sheer longevity of it, whether the model of people who go in and out of government over 4 or 5 decades has been broken, or whether you see, if you look forward another quarter century, some of the people who are influential in policy debates today will continue to be so then, or is this sort of continuity kind of broken down?
It's a very hard but very important question. I think Nitze would not be able to have the career that he did today, and part of it is just from the partisanship, in that he was a Republican, then he was a Democrat, then he was a Republican, then he was a Democrat. His two favorite presidents to work for are Harry Truman and Ronald Reagan. It's hard. There aren't a whole lot of people besides career officials who are able to move in at high levels. Though Gates has done it at defense and state, sort of move in and out between the parties. And he's fired by Republicans, he's fired by Democrats, he's promoted by Republicans, he's promoted by Democrats. He really is his own party, his own views. That would have been hard. Today I think it would have been more likely he would have stuck with one side and gone in and been the wise elder for the Democrats and served when they were in power and gone down to Florida and during the 2000 election, right? And, so that would be hard. I think Kennan would have. I think he would have had a similar career if he'd been born 40 years later. People would have recognized his brilliance. Some Democrat would have brought him in. He would have alienated him completely. He would have left in a huff, and then he would have become a great intellectual, selling books and writing essays. And I think I think the path for Kennan is more open. Another interesting question, which it's so hard to prove whether or not it's true, is that these guys are friends, right? So they're utterly convinced the other is going to blow up the world. That if we follow their strategy, that Kennan absolutely believes that Nitze will destroy the world, and Nitze absolutely believes that if Kennan's views are taken, the Russians will overrun Western Europe. But they're friends, and they write these warm letters throughout. Kennan attended my parents' wedding. They have this nice closeness, and that's certainly still possible today. But it's as things get more partisan and things get a little hotter, it's harder to do that.
So if you were going to start a new think tank, the New America Foundation, and both these individuals were available to run your think tank, who would you?
I would set Kennan as the figurehead, and I would have Nitze run it.
Right. And I guess that's how Nitze described the implementation of the containment policy.
Right, absolutely, right. And the Marshall Plan is another example. So some of the crucial questions in the Marshall Plan, right? Should we dictate what it is, or should we let the Europeans decide for themselves? Who should we include, who should we not include? These crucial, complicated, big questions are decided by Kennan. But then it comes time to testify, and Kennan says, I can't testify, I hate Congress. And Nitze goes and testifies for 15 days straight. So the grunt work actually would be, the grunt work. I mean, it's Paul Nitze. That's a terrible way to say it. But the actual operational work would be done by Nitze. But Kennan, he was able to foresee things that very few foreign policy thinkers have ever been able to foresee. And he wrote he's absolutely the best writer of any anybody who's been inside of government that I've read, and both from the style of his prose to the clarity of his prose to the clarity of his thinking. So if I had a new think tank, I would absolutely want George Kennan on board, and I'd want Nitze too.
You mentioned the writing, and I have to digress here for 1 second. I actually brought I read this book in high school. This is Kennan's Russia Leaves the War, and one of his first, I guess, truly sort of purely historical works that he wrote in '56. At the same time that he was writing in his diary that we should get rid of California, Florida, and Texas, and it led me to major in Russian history and go to grad school in Russian history. I just want to read, because everybody always says that Kennan is such a great writer, and many of you probably have already read him, but just to remind ourselves, and for those of you who haven't, I just want to take a moment and read the first 2 paragraphs of this book, the opener, if you'll indulge me. The city of St. Petersburg, Petrograd, Leningrad, call it what you will, is one of the strangest, loveliest, most terrible, and most dramatic of the world's great urban centers. The high northern latitude, the extreme slant of the sun's rays, the flatness of the terrain, the frequent breaking of the landscape by wide, shimmering expanses of water, all these combine to accent the horizontal at the expense of the vertical, and to create everywhere the sense of immense space, distance, and power. The heaven is vast, the skyline remote and extended. Cleaving the city down the center, the cold waters of the Neva move silently and swiftly, like a slab of smooth gray metal, past the granite embankments and the ponderous palaces, bringing with them the tang of the lonely wastes of forest and swamp from which they have emerged. At every hand, one feels the proximity of the great wilderness of the Russian north, silent, somber, infinitely patient. Over this community there pass, in endless rhythm, the characteristic seasons of the north, the long winters of snow and darkness, the protracted in-between seasons of gray skies, slush, and pervasive dampness, the white nights of the summer solstice, with their unbelievable eerie poetry, and finally the brief, pathetic summers, suggestive rather than explicit, drawing to a close almost before they have begun, passionately cherished by the inhabitants for their very rareness and brevity. In such a city, the attention of man is forced inward upon himself and his own kind. Human relationships attain a strange vividness and intensity with the touch of premonition. Under such a sky, fingers of fate seem to reach in from a great distance, like the beams of the sun, to find and shape the lives and affairs of individuals. Events have a tendency to move with dramatic precision to denouements which no one devised, but which everyone recognizes after the fact as inevitable and somehow faintly familiar. So, I mean, the guy writes far too well to be in government.
Right.
Or maybe even to be in academia. And I love how, later on he develops this relationship with Stalin's daughter, who he helps bring over. And she writes him these admonishing letters saying, why are you frustrated that you're not in government? You're a writer and deal with it.
The relationship with Stalin's daughter was one of the craziest things I came upon in the book, in that I know that he helps her. It's sort of public knowledge that he helps her defect. He works at the CIA, gets her over here. And so I said, all right, well, she'd be an interesting person to talk to. And so I find out where she lives, and I send her a letter. And she says, yes, I'd love to talk. And then she loves to talk and talk and talk. And so we end up exchanging 75 letters. I go and interview her several times. And she has these incredible theories of, George Kennan, and these deep theories. And then I find these old letters that she wrote to him, including, Dear George, I've always wanted to tell you this. You're unhappy. And here's why you're unhappy. And then, very perceptively, I showed it to one of Kennan's children, and he said, "Oh my God," And so she's this incredibly. Well, she's quite. She had a complicated father, so she has a very interesting.
When Stalin's daughter's telling you to get a grip,
Yeah. She's crazy in a lot of ways, but she's also incredibly trenchant and perceptive about Kennan. And so she was one of the most interesting people I interviewed for this book. And there's a lot of stories from her life that animate the later chapters.
It's really just frustrating to read about this guy who was so brilliant, and he's stewing off on his farm that he's not getting called up by people in government. And it's you kind of want to shake him too and be like, you've got better things to do.
There's so many times where
we don't know anybody like that at think tanks, really, waiting to get calls to go into government, but he's a...
Well, while he's denouncing it, he's an amazing mind, yeah.
Just to close the loop, here's the diary passage that I referenced that he was writing apparently at the same time that he was working on that book. He says, I ought in truth to have nothing to do with either political party. I hold no ironclad brief for unity. I'm not sure that we would not be much better off without California and Texas and Florida. By shedding our Latin American fringe, we might have preserved something like a Northern European civilization in the remainder of the country. So he sort of fetishizes northern climates, too.
Fetishizes northern climate. He loves the
Married
Wisconsin
in a-
of his youth. He wanted Vermont to break off, become an independent state, closed off to people from Latin America in his later years. So, yeah.
So how do you think, I mean, you're a writer, and as you just pointed out, you admire the quality of his writing as we all should. How did that help or hinder him as he was going about his career in government?
Well, it helped him to get noticed in that he, part of the reason why the long telegram was and it's a telegram, so it's clipped short sentences, but part of the reason why it got so much attention was that it's so wonderfully written. The same thing with the X article. So George Kennan goes from utter obscurity in the beginning of February 1946 to being one of the most wanted men in government by the end of February 1946 because of this telegram. So his prose absolutely helps him get noticed, but people quickly tire of it because in government you have to make quick decisions. So Dean Acheson would get these long memos from Kennan and just slap his forehead and laugh and put them aside. Harry Truman wouldn't read them. The fact that he was a good writer was helpful. The fact that he cared so much about his writing and that he wouldn't want anybody to edit it. When he was head of the policy planning staff, they would meet and talk, and then he would say, I'm going to write this, and guys aren't going to touch it. Nitze would write, it was a collaboration, get everybody involved, get everybody working on it. They'd have more ownership. Kennan didn't want it.
If only he could have blogged.
Oh my God, there would have been 3,000 word blog posts every week.
Right. Maybe have him just Twitter.
I think the Twitter.
So going back to the kind of the arc of sort of how the Cold War plays out and the policy debates, what would you say was the biggest mistake that each one made?
The biggest mistake in terms of its consequences, or the moment where they were most wrong?
Take your pick.
You could say that the biggest mistake that Nitze made was pushing forward the arms race without any sense or care or worry or deliberate attempt to try to understand what this would mean. If we go forward, they will do this. If they do that, we will do this. He looked at it from the moment of February, 1950 or November 1949. What should we do? And the answer, as he looked at the mathematics, was that we should build a hydrogen bomb. The next question is, if we build a hydrogen bomb, what will the Soviets build next, and what will we build? And then the clear ineluctable outcome is that we will end up with a massive arms race that will take billions of dollars and threaten the world. And so you can say that's his biggest mistake, but it's actually hard to fault him there because it was Joseph Stalin on the other side, and no one, there are lots of people who talk about, if only we'd followed the Acheson-Lilienthal report. There's nothing that's really totally believable about another way to get out of that period. So I think the moment where I would criticize him the most is is in the late 70s, where he not only is a vicious critic of SALT II for reasons that are personal as much as they are analytical, he also plays a very crafty and interesting role in leaking baloney information about a Cuban brigade in 1979 that ends up being, as one person said, the banana peel that ends SALT II. And so he plays a very devious role to stop an arms treaty that would not have done remotely what he said it would have done. So I think I'm going to go with that period. For Kennan, his greatest mistake is, you just have to. It's the racism, anti-Semitism. It's the unwillingness to accept America as a place where people of different cultures, ideas, and languages can congregate and something. You can make a wonderful country out of it. And his sense that the undertone of that passage and 50 other passages in his diaries are, if only it was just the white people in Wisconsin and Vermont, this country would be okay. And that's, not only disagreeable, but wrong. So that's his, and so he wasn't able, and that's something that people who are close to him would always try to, shake him and say, Kenny, you're so smart. Can't you figure out that this experiment in multiculturalism and immigration is actually working? And he just didn't get it.
I was really struck. I had I'd never known that until I read your book that he considered, at least for a moment, running for Congress.
Yeah, and for Senate, actually.
And then I loved you had a passage where you said that Acheson cracked up when he heard about this.
Yeah,
just the thought of it.
The idea of George Kennan kissing a baby made it. Right. When Acheson and Nitze were told about it, they just started laughing uproariously. Yeah.
Just we're going to open it up to questions in a second. Before we do, I just wanted to, on Nitze, and you were talking about the sort of deviousness of the Cuban brigade angle. I was, one of the things that I found a little bit appalling, perhaps devious, was the way in which he backed the Reagan administration's sort of retreat from the ABM treaty, this so-called broad interpretation.
Right.
A treaty that he had negotiated. And then he found ways for the administration to have wiggle room and to proceed with experimenting and testing the so-called Star Wars system. And it wasn't clear as to why he did that, whether it was just his competitive juices where the boss had said, let's find a way to do this, and he just sort of cynically found went along with the State Department legal advisors' clever interpretation, or whether he thought this was the ultimate culmination of his kind of career-long view that if we just outspend the Soviets and keep building, we will prevail. Did he buy into Reagan's Star Wars vision, setting aside whether it was going to actually work or not? But did he buy into it as sort of the terror that it would, that it was causing among the Soviets and what it might lead to in terms of ultimate negotiations, or what? Why did he do that?
Well, the second part I think I can answer better than the first part. The second part, so why did his view on Star Wars is that Reagan gives a speech and he says this is baloney, this will never work, and he gives this, writes about he talks about the marginal cost of improving defense versus the marginal cost of improving offense, and that ratio will never be in favor of defense. So therefore, it will always be more expensive for us to put one more unit of defense up than for them to create one more unit of offense. So therefore, it doesn't make any sense. However, he noticed very quickly that the Soviets were freaked out about it, and so he then said, well, great. I think this is a chimera. I think this is baloney. I think we'll never build it. The technology won't work. Even if it does, it wouldn't make any sense to do it. But they seem worried about it, so let's bargain away for it. And so he, one thing, you can call it cynical devious, some people call it genius, is he tries to actually, one of his sort of craftier moves in the 80s, he tries to it's kind of a sting operation within a sting operation, where he knows that Richard Pearl is his great enemy, and he knows that Weinberger and Pearl are going to try to stop any arms deal that he pushes. So he's, okay, how can we get an arms deal through without them getting involved? And so he sets up this elaborate thing where they're going to, Schultz is going to drop a hint to his Soviet counterpart. They're going to get a document in front of Reagan that McFarlane will give him, that Reagan will then sign without reading. And it works. Reagan signs a document without reading that McFarlane gives to him that authorizes this great arms deal. Then they bring it to Schultz, but Schultz doesn't quite get what's going on, and Nitze can't quite bring himself to say we're trying to route around Reagan, and so it falls apart. But his goal in 85 through 1986, at Reykjavik is, let's take this thing that I think is ridiculous, that I know will never work, and let's trade it for something. Then back to the question of the broad interpretation. This was something where it wasn't just that the State Department had given a broad interpretation and he had gone along with it. He had gotten a meeting with the main lawyer for the State Department and said, okay, here's the treaty. What is the maximum amount of room we have in it? And so he is entirely responsible for the origins of the broad interpretation of the treaty. And he certainly did it partly for political reasons. Schultz said, tell us what we can get out of this. But he ended up really believing the broad interpretation. And I found a wonderful letter. This guy, David Callahan, wrote a very interesting book called Dangerous Capabilities. And it's a broadside against Nitze. Nitze brought us the Cold War and all these horrible things. It's written in 1988. So it's before the Cold War ends, before Nitze is vindicated, and where he's this great arch enemy of the left. And there's a letter from Nitze to Callahan. And he says, Dear David, I've read your book with much interest. There are two things I think you get wrong. The first is the ABM treaty. And I have a whole annex to my memoirs where I talk about why actually the broad interpretation is the proper interpretation. And the second thing, you got the color of my eyes wrong. And it struck me then, because when I found that letter, it was very late in my report, and I had sort of ascribed to the cynical view that he had just sort of taken the marching orders that were to get as much wiggle room as you can under ABM, And that's how they came up with a broad interpretation. And that's why I pushed it. And then reading that letter and then going back and looking through the details with which he defended his position, which, as some people in this room know, is an extraordinarily complex debate that has been playing out for decades, I think he may have come to it cynically, and he may have approached the task as though he's going to do the job, but I think he genuinely believed it by the end.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, well, why don't we open it up to questions and comments from the audience? Sir in the back.
Andrew Pierre, Georgetown University. I haven't read your book, but I'm going to because you describe it in a fascinating way, and it is a unique book. I'd like to take the occasion, therefore, to sort of try to get you to probe a little bit more into the psychology and personality of your grandfather. Apart from his years in government, he's also spent years at meetings like this. He loved the nonprofit, public policy, foreign policy sector. I saw him every year at IISS meetings and so on. And what struck me, he listened, he debated, but there was never any evidence that his mind would change on anything. Now, you're giving a more complex portrait, I think, of him right now. But outwardly at least, he seemed to have a certain amount of rigidity, and which probably is not the way he was inwardly. And so my question is a little bit about the extent to which he had self-doubt, self-criticism, hesitation, about some of the things he was saying, in particular about using technological arguments to negate political points, which is something he very often did, it seemed to me. And my second and minor question is, he was never a cabinet officer, although clearly he could have been, or perhaps he wasn't offered, I don't know. I'm sort of wondering whether this was something that rankled him, or he really felt above being a cabinet officer because he had all this power and influence over the years.
Well, I can answer the second question, which we'll get at the first one, which is it drove him crazy. And there would be, moments where the family would, where the family would tread very carefully whenever he was passed over by whatever administration had just passed over, because he really believed that he was, certainly from maybe not in 1961, but for every presidential transition then, he had hoped to be Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State, or possibly Secretary of the Treasury. And he was passed over nonstop until maybe the Reagan years where he was too old and it was okay. It's telling that the only two secretaries of state he got along with were Dean Acheson when he was too young and George Shultz when he was too old. So yes, that absolutely rankled him. Was he a man of self-doubt? He was a man of self-doubt, not the way Kennan was a man of self-doubt. So one of the complicated things about writing this book is that he's my grandfather. You would think I would have far greater psychological insights into him, but he didn't keep diaries. He didn't write personal letters. He didn't talk about his inner fears to a whole lot of people. The people who for example, my mother and father, who knew him extremely well and did talk about these things, did talk about his sense of doubt, his frustration at elements of his childhood, his frustrations with his father, when he was very, very old, he would often have nightmares about what he had seen at Hiroshima, and a sense of, my God, could I have done this again? And so there's another moment that was quite telling that I learned about when I was doing interviews, where, because he's at Hiroshima, a month after the bomb goes off, so he sees it. He sees what this is like. And at some point, somebody at dinner, at the family dinner table, says, the problem. It's a guest says, you don't understand what nuclear war is really like. You don't, that's the problem. You're too mathematical. You're too rigid. And he, my uncle described it as the one moment he saw my grandfather, the most emotionally I ever saw my grandfather. My grandfather saying, look, I have actually been there. I really do understand it. There are times where I have to take a very clinical approach because that will get us to the right policies, and that will help us understand how we can negotiate the best treaties. But this is something that, I understand in a way that someone who wasn't there couldn't understand it. And I think that's partly why, at the end of his life, these memories of his period in Hiroshima would bubble up. So he certainly was a man of self-doubt. He certainly was a man who understood the stakes, but he was also a man who understood that to get what he wanted, sometimes it would be very important to take technological arguments to answer questions clinically and analytically.
Sure.
Hi, I went to the Paul H. Nitze School of Advanced International Studies and played football at your grandfather's farm on more than one occasion. I also sort of broke with him because I declined an invitation to join the Committee on the Present Danger.
Mm-hmm.
And I see that you talk about Team B
Mm-hmm.
in your book. Did he see that as spawning off or helping to create the neoconservative movement, and did he have any comment on that? Or do you think that's a false connection?
It's certainly not a false connection. There's certainly, you can draw lots of lines from Team B outward to the neoconservative movement, as several authors have done in recent years quite well. You can also say, I mean, one of the most interesting facts about my grandfather is that in 1969 he forms a new group called the Committee for Prudent Defense Policy and chooses 4 interns. 4 interns are Richard Pearl, Paul Wolfowitz, Edward Luttwak, and Peter Wilson. I mean, that's an interesting crop of interns if you want to talk about the legacy. He certainly saw the Team B relationship as very connected to the Committee on the Present Danger. He certainly saw his mission in those years part of his mission to correct the faulty, soft vision of the Soviets that people in the rest of the government had. And then did it lead to neoconservatism? I think by the time people were talking about neoconservatism in the way we talk about it now, suddenly it's 2001, 2002. My grandfather was out of it. He was 95 years old, and he could sort of sit there. He was very old, but also it was still the old Paul Nitze. You couldn't get him to answer questions like, how do you feel about the legacy of that? And that's something I wish I could have. But just one sort of personal memory, which is I went to his house. It's one of the last conversations we had. He's very old. He's 90, died when he was 97. And there are all these books of Conrad on the shelf, and they're all worn through. And I said, sort of startled. I said, Gramps, how did you have time to read these? Didn't you spend your whole life in government negotiating treaties? And he sort of pauses, and he doesn't speak very much at all. You say maybe a sentence every 5 minutes, and he looks up and he says, Conrad is interesting. Missiles are boring.
Hi, Ava Spolin. Congratulations, and I
Thanks.
really look forward to reading the book. I have a question about Kennan, and that is whether you think that the advent of nuclear weapons in 45 and thereafter changed his view about how we should deal with the Russians. I mean, not the sort of basic containment policy, but you can argue that before that, he basically said, give Eastern Europe to the Russians and let them have it, and let's not have anything to do with them. They're not fit for us to. They're not fit partners for the United States. But afterwards, there is much more about the need to engage, and arguably this is one of the issues that divided him from your grandfather. And it's just sort of not there before nuclear weapons, it seems. Yeah. And I'm wondering if you would sort of agree with
there
that.
There are 2 things that are essential. One is nuclear weapons. So as soon as nuclear weapons appear, Kennan, who has this dark sense of foreboding of the world's destruction, and he has nuclear weapons completely transform the way he sees the Cold War, and suddenly it's the stakes are different, the consequences are completely different, and he snaps in a way, and that sets him on a different path. And then the second thing, though, that really matters to him and that he points as the signal moment where his views on the Cold War change is Stalin's death. And so he believes that after 1953, the Soviet Union is a completely different partner, and there are many more opportunities to engage with it. And so it's a combination of those 2 things that really change him and set him on the path for the rest of his career.
Sir, up front.
I think it may be a related question, but let me phrase it anyway. The question that I wanted to pose was how pure was this perspective about containment to be non-militaristic? You've mentioned the letters that got chucked.
Yeah.
And related to that, though I don't care much for the phrase. In retrospect, is Kennan sort of the first soft power guy in American foreign policy?
So I don't know if he's the first, but he certainly, if you look at the long telegram, it's the whole last section is about soft power, and it's something that people don't usually remember or notice. And it says, so the question is, how do you deal with the Soviet Union? And he says, well, you set a good example for the world, and you make our institutions at home stronger. By making our institutions at home stronger, you'll therefore shine a light that the rest of the world will follow. And one of the most complicated, aggravating things about Kennan's writing is that he always says this. It's in the X article. It's in every essay he ever writes, and he doesn't say exactly how or why or what he means. But it sounds really good, and it's quoted often that we should make our institutions at home stronger, and if we make the United States better, it will sort of soft power theory. And one wonders whether what he really meant is if we get rid of Texas, Florida, right? I mean, it's kind of there, and he doesn't say it outright. Probably smartly doesn't say it completely. My view on how militaristic was his view of containment, certainly more than he would claim in later years, but certainly less than his critics said. And one important example is the CIA engagement, which he denied, but which he had a huge involvement in setting up covert operations and helped plan our covert operations in Albania, for example, something I learned. The famously failed covert operations that were busted by Kim Philby, those were designed in large part by George Kennan. So he wasn't all about soft power and niceness. I mean, Kennan, his son-in-law said something to me, and I was interviewing him about the CIA stuff. His son-in-law had also been his lawyer, and he said, look, let's just stop here. We're not going to talk about everything, but just remember this. George Kennan knew that there are things you have to do in the dark of night. And that was sort of, okay, that actually helped me understand this period quite a bit better.
He supported our involvement in Korea, right? And
he absolutely
was
supported
sort of
our
an
involvement in
architect
Korea.
of what happened.
Yeah,
in
we had to go.
Greece and Turkey and
Absolutely. In Korea, I mean, he got everything right in the Korean War. We should go in there. We should not go in there. I mean, he anticipated everything that would happen in the Korean War. It's part of his brilliance. And he also amazingly understood that the Soviet Union wasn't really engaged, and that he has these memos that he writes in June and early July of 1950 where he says, look, this is not a Soviet operation. My guess is that the North Koreans have been pestering Stalin for a while. He hasn't given them the green light, and he sort of finally just grudgingly gave them the green light, and they're ahead, and the Soviets are sort of behind it, which we now know from all the documents is exactly what happened. And Kennan picks this up from reading Pravda. I interviewed Henry Kissinger at one point, and he said, there's this amazing thing about Kennan. He comes in 1968, and he comes up to me and he says, you're planning to open relationships with China, aren't you? And Kissinger says, why do you know that? And Kennan says, I've been reading the State Department documents about exchange rates in Taiwan. What? But he just had this ability to see what was happening.
sure.
Tom Hughes. I'd like to ask a question about the self-awareness of these two gentlemen when it comes to polarizing the rest of the community. I became aware of this first when I was Hubert Humphrey's legislative counsel in 1958, and when I left, Humphrey, who was thinking of running for president, and his advisors said, well, you need two people to succeed Hughes. You need somebody like Ernest Lefevre, because he's an admirer of Nitze, and Al Lowenstein, who's an admirer of Kennan. And the two of them ended up on the Humphrey staff briefly together. And it struck me at the time that they'd had a polarizing effect already that early on the public community that was full of aspirant people around Washington. And yet I thought they had a lot more in common. Maybe the book tells us how much more they have in common. But they were both intellectuals. They were both enamored of the policy process. They both had a Midwestern sort of background. They both were definitely Northern Europeanists. They had a kind of positive ambivalent feeling, both of them, about Germany, for instance. I think of them as having a considerable overlap, and which would tend to counter the proposition that they should have been real polarizers. I wonder if you could comment on that.
That is a very perceptive point from the man who was in the room when Acheson and Nitze learned that Kennan was running for Congress. And they both started laughing uproariously. They did have a lot in common. And part of the book, this is why the Hawk and the Dove, I love it as a title, but it's as I say in the introduction, it's misleading in that they do, on this issue of nuclear weapons, of course, they're in entirely different poles. And on the issue of American engagement with the world, they would have sort of different founding philosophies. But on Korea, they're sitting side by side, planning policies together. In Vietnam, they're in opposite areas. Nitze's on the inside, Kennan's on the outside, but they're thinking very similarly. And I think part of what drives their friendship is that they do get along. My grandfather had one thing he always would say when asked about George Kennan. He would say, "I don't disagree with George on anything except matters of substance." So, and that gets at it partly. And that, as you say, they're both. They both grow up in the Midwest. They actually attend the same summer camp, not at the same time. They, one goes to Princeton, one goes to Harvard. They're both in Germany at the same time. They work very closely on designing America's German policy in the 1940s. Like, there is a lot that these two men have in common and that they do similarly. So yes, I think you are right. Tactically, they operate quite differently. On a lot of issues, they are quite different. Yes, on the big issues of the day, one is a hawk and one is a dove, but part of the reason they keep their friendship is because they're not quite as dissimilar as some people thought.
Sir?
Thank you. Marty Sherwin, George Mason University. You talk about this in the book, but and I'd like you to expand on it a little bit in terms of the process that Paul Nitze went through moving from a hawk on nuclear issues to a dove. Both the personal, perhaps recollections of Hiroshima, but also the environment as it changed both in America and in the Soviet Union, and what he saw, and whether there are any implications for that today. But start with the beginning.
So one thing that happens at the end of Nitze's life is that he becomes a nuclear abolitionist. And the origins of this book come from an op-ed that my grandfather wrote in 1999, where he puts out an op-ed in the New York Times saying we should get rid of all nuclear weapons. And he gets a letter from George Kennan. It says, "Dear Paul, I read your recent op-ed in the New York Times with great interest. Isn't it nice that after 50 years we finally agree on something?" And my grandfather had received that letter a day. I was having dinner with him, read it out loud, and that was what planted the seed for this book. So my grandfather does become a nuclear abolitionist after 10 years after the Cold War has ended. And it's a slow and steady process where he participates in a study group with Barry Bleckman in, I think it was 1995, where the discussion initially comes up, should we abolish all the nuclear weapons? And he starts leaning in that direction. And then by the end of his life, he feels, it's a very, I think it's like all Paul Nitze decisions, it's a very rational one that he probably lined out on a big pad of yellow paper, which is, okay, what are the situations in which we might use nuclear weapons? What could we use? Why are they needed? Who is threatening us with them? How much of a deterrent effect do they have? How much do we have to worry about nuclear blackmail? He sort of works through the logic chain and decides that the situation is entirely different. There is no Soviet Union that's threatening Western Europe and possibly threatening all non-communist societies across the world. There's no one who is ideologically and fundamentally opposed to our way of life and our democratic system. And there's certainly no one who is that way who we need to deter with nuclear weapons. So the risk that they could get out, or that the fact that we have the stockpile will lead to more proliferation, exceeds the limited benefits we get from them. Therefore, we should abandon them all. And so talk about Nitze changing his mind. By the end of his life, Nitze saying we should take all these things that I spent my life getting us to build and we should throw them into the ocean. And is there anything that we can learn from that? I don't think that you're going to find, in his papers, his documents, or his notes, you're going to find he's 90 years old at this time. You're not going to find like a great master plan or something that the nuclear abolitionists that are out there today and that are prominent in Washington right now that they haven't thought of or talked through. But it is very interesting to have seen somebody go from his position to another. And it actually speaks well of his independence of mind that he wouldn't spend his last years trying to just defend every decision that he made and trying to pump up his legacy and say, I was right here, I was right there. And he didn't go and say, I was wrong, I made a big mistake. He said, times have changed, I've reanalyzed it, and I think we should do things differently. And I think that speaks well of him there.
Speaking of grids and charts and decision-making flows, one of my favorite nuggets in your book was there's a moment where Kennan is, one of the many moments where Kennan is disaffected and anxious about what to do next, and I guess it's right in the late 40s, right before he's given this plum job at State Department running the policy planning shop, and he's like, what am I going to do with my life? And he has this great grid with the options and then criteria, the sort of vertical column is, should I go into business or stay in government, academia? But then I love the last one is farming.
Right.
And then across the horizontal column is the criteria that, money, satisfaction, travel.
Right.
Am I doing right by my family? And he's trying to.
I loved it when I came across that
Farming.
in his diaries. I thought it was one of the funniest things I'd ever found.
Here in the second row.
Thank you. I'm Tom Blea. I'm a freelance writer who knew your grandfather, worked with him a bit at SAIS. It seems to me, did you probably showed rather than told about there's a psychological question again about the two men. It strikes me that Kennan, for example, is a rather pure psychological type, introvert, heavy on intuition. Any clue in Pravda or wherever will fill in a map for him very quickly. Whereas your grandfather, extrovert, and a little more difficult to pinpoint psychologically. But by just sheer coincidence, having read Liar's Poker for the second time here, and the great amusement of bond traders there saying that, he only looked 3 steps ahead. I wondered to what extent your grandfather's experience with the bond market may have influenced his thinking.
Yeah, so that's, I think, actually quite a bit. My grandfather, before he goes into government, he works on Wall Street. He works for Dillon Reed, and he's a financier, and he spends his first 11 professional years doing that. He claims to be the last man hired before the Great Depression. And then sort of by the late 30s, he's become dissatisfied. He thinks there's something bigger, and he goes into Washington. But what he learns there is that's where he learns to think mathematically. I mean, he studies economics in college, so a little bit. But when he talks about those years, there's one memory that really comes out. It's in all of his stories, and it's in his memoirs, and it's of sitting with Clarence Dillon, and it's at the job interview right at the very beginning, and Dillon says, "Do you know what I have here?" And my grandfather says, "What do you have here?" He says, "I have a spreadsheet." And, "Well, do you know what I'm doing?" "I don't know what you're doing with it." And I'm going through it for the 50th time, and I'm going to understand exactly what is in the spreadsheet, and I'm going to understand exactly how it works. And I have the smartest minds working for me, but I'm going to do it myself as well. And my grandfather, whether it's, of course, as all tales that one tells when describing one's life, it's not, who knows exactly how it happened, but the fact that he picked it certainly showed that it had influence, and what it represented had influence, and that is that there are logic chains, right? There's this famous Nitze logic chain that lots of people who worked with him would talk about. You go from step A to step B to step C to step D. And I think he developed a very analytical, very mathematical mind in those early years while trying to work out, capitalization of deals. And I think, Kennan spends his early years, learning Russia and writing this poetry. And my grandfather spends these years, running the numbers. So is it a surprise that by the time it comes to the late 1970s, one of them is, well, if we have 262 SLBMs and 1,342 ICBMs, and the other says, "Oh my God, I don't want anything to do with those things." You can see that from their origins.
Any other questions?
Sure.
Sure.
I'm Gary Mitchell from the Mitchell Report. Thanks. I'm curious to know what did Stalin's daughter tell Kennan about why he was so unhappy?
That he had denied himself what he really wanted to do in life, which was to be alone and to write great books. And that because he was stuck with his obsession about policy and, would get unhappy at the fact that he wasn't involved, that was part of his problem. Another part of his problem was that he had married a woman who worshipped him and did not, I think properly challenge him was another one of the things that she brought up in that particular letter. Crushing Norwegian, uniformity or something, I think is the accurate phrase that she used.
In the back.
Zachary Davis, I'm from the Carnegie Endowment, and I have a question. You mentioned earlier in the discussion about how do we compare these statesmen with those of today, and especially how does our current foreign policy establishment perform at producing statesmen, and do we have the kind of political system that that does choose the best people for these kinds of positions. And I just wonder, as someone who's studied the past in this era, what do you think about the way that today's foreign policy is made and the people implementing them?
Kennan would say that Kennan was quite frustrated. He believed that foreign policy training had faltered in a way, and that people weren't disciplined the same way, and that too many people came in and they weren't of high quality. He wanted to start a foreign policy school that would train people the way that he'd been trained. But I think one thing that's interesting is that people come into government when government is an exciting place to be. So Nitze joins the government during the Roosevelt administration because it's where bright young people go. And he's a bright young person, and he thinks, this is a real opportunity to do something good with my life. And I think actually we're going to see government is exciting. I mean, I think we've seen this in the last year. You've seen, partly for, you don't want to sound partisan here, but partly, people there are a lot of people very excited about the problems of change that Obama brings. And so I think it's sort of a self-correcting problem in that when government seems exciting and like the right place to be, it will draw in the right people who will then go on to have long, or when there are huge crises, like financial crises to solve. This is an amazing time to be in government because you have power and influence. Like the last 8 years, forget about whether it's Republican or Democrat, but it was a period where government seemed to be losing influence and less important. Technology is what's most important. Let's work for a consultant. The brightest young man, so let's go work for a consulting company. Or when, I finished college, it was part of the Silicon Valley boom, right? Who's going to go to government then? Come on, right? If you want to, change the world, you go to Silicon Valley. And so I think as that is now changing, I think more people like Nitze and Kennan are going into government, and that's probably a good thing.
I think it was also reading the book, you also get this historical sense of how the center of gravity of policy making has shifted, towards the White House. I mean, early on in their careers, they really are making policy and grappling with all of these wrenching historical debates in the State Department, and you have the sense of a president in the White House kind of waiting to hear from his
waiting to hear from the policy planning staff. Which if you ask the people at the policy planning staff now, they're important, wonderful jobs, but I don't think they really think that Obama.
And also maybe we could just wrap up, given that we're in this world of think tanks and policy, the sort of policy industry in Washington. I mean, it's a remarkable thing that your grandfather did almost as sort of an aside at a very early stage. I mean, he sort of midway, just getting started in his career, and kind of on the side he starts SICE. Talk a little bit about.
It's one of the more bizarre episodes. In some ways, it's it's presented as this heroic. Paul Nitze, who had this great career in foreign policy, founded SICE. Decided they needed to have a school to train people of life of the mind, and was a professor there, and he would use it his whole life. And when I was looking into it, it struck me as phenomenally weird in that when he founded it, you almost wouldn't accept him as a graduate student there. I mean, it's just a very different time. He knew nothing. He had worked in government for a year. I mean, he had no experience. He had big ideas, and so he went with it, and it worked. I mean, so God bless him for going forward with it. He was younger than I am now and had about as much experience in government as I do now, which is zero. Besides summer internship in the National Park Service. So. And yet he founds a school which goes on to become one of the great institutions of feeding people into government. So
that was pretty cool.
Pretty amazing. Yeah, it's very cool.
Well, Nick, congratulations. It really is a great book. And
thanks, Andreas.
And thank you all for coming, and hope to see you at more of these. Thanks.
All right.